Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Warframe guide. Kick up your feet, sit back, and relax, because today we're going to be looking at the bosses in the Assassination missions of Warframe. This will not include the Eidolons or special encounters such as the Stalker or Orb Mothers, as those can be used for different videos entirely. Instead, we're looking at the specific assassination missions, words I can even, that come at the end of planets, and also the amazing things that they then drop as well, whilst also being able to take advantage of frames and the mechanics of your frames to make these fights as simple and as easy as possible. Let's start from the beginning, shall we? The first boss you're going to encounter is Captain Vor. This dude is found on Mercury. He will be the first boss you ever fight in the game once you complete the tutorial. Vor uses a seer, which deals a small amount of explosive damage, and also uses Cronus to knock back enemies, and also utilizes a shield once enough damage is dealt to him, which then revitalizes after a small intermission. Through the entire encounter, you'll be dealing with low-level Grineer Lancers and low-level Grineer Bombards. Every time the shields are refreshed after he's lost a certain amount of health, he will gain a new ability. The first time the shields go back up, he will start deploying Nervos mines. These you do not want to stand in. The second time the shields regenerate, he will dismiss his guns and start using an Orkan laser, which will start blasting the ever-loving hell out of you. This deals a lot of individual damage, and he will always fixate one target and either follow that player if he moves out of range. Being new, the best advice I can give you is to make use of the frames you'll likely have available to you. Mag is going to be very good with Polarize to take care of Vor's shields and to deal with the adds in the area as well. If you can, then utilize corrosive or magnetic damage to also take advantage of the elements he comes with as well. Excalibur is very likely going to be very useful for handling the adds around, as well as using Volt's discharge to keep them under control as well. Captain Vor's drops, he uniquely drops Seer and Cronus as well as the components therein, as well as dropping a lot of very early game mods such as Intensify, Vitality and Heated Charge, as well as early game Orkan cells. When it comes to the drops on these encounters, we will only explain the items that are useful, and eventually we will also cut out the mods. Just let me know that a lot of the early game bosses also drop a lot of early game mods that will be very useful for you. Jackal is generally the second boss you're going to encounter within Warframe. He is found on Venus through Fossa. Each player of your team will need to be present to actually start this encounter, so you can't just go in by yourself if there's 3 other people with your team. Jackal is quite a unique encounter. He is a giant jackal robot, multi-legged beast. His main abilities are a rippling shockwave, which will more often than not knock you into the pits that lie around the arena, so you need to be spatially aware as to what is going on around you and not position yourself too close to the outside edge. He also uses plasma grenade clusters, which will fire out multiple grenades in different directions, shown by little rings on the ground. If you're struck by one of these will deal 100 to 200 damage each, and he also fires rockets. These can be parried by using your melee weapon, which will then either nullify all the damage or a very large portion of it. He also summons Mine Ospreys, which will dump mines all around the map. Using a frame to crowd control them, or just focusing them is the best option here. The encounter of Jackal is pretty straightforward. The Jackal is initially completely immune to damage. The only way to actually progress the encounter is by shooting out its legs. Initially, you'll need to shoot out 2 of its legs to cause the body to slump down, and then expose the body. You shoot the body enough times until it becomes immune to damage again, and then you rinse and repeat. If you do not damage the legs quickly enough, then they will begin regenerating their health, as well as their shields. The best advice for this encounter is to bring radiation or magnetic damage to take advantage of the alloy armor, as well as the shields. Keeping an eye on the Ospreys to make sure there's not too many of them is also very advisable, and using Excalibur can very easily take advantage of the limbs as well as the body, as the Exalted Blade swipes can take out multiple limbs at the same time. The drops for Jackal are Rhino, so all the components there are in for Rhino, as well as Blunderbuss, Tactical Pump, Handspring, and early game Orkan Cell, as well as Field Run samples. Vahek. Now this one's a bit of an interesting one. Vahek spawns on Oro on Earth. This will appear in a arena-style sequence. You're going to start at the beginning of the map where Vahek will appear. He will then lead you through multiple different areas of the map where you are intended to fight him. However, you do not need to do this, as if you just find the exit to that part of the arena and then move on to the next room, he will then leave and skip ahead. You can do this in every room until you get to the final quarter, where you have to travel down a pipe, which will then lead you to the final arena, and he will then appear there, meaning you don't even need to fight him up until that point.
When you begin the encounter, he will start off in his drone form, and he will utilize a menagerie of different weapons. He will use machine guns, which deal small amounts of damage, but at a very high rate. He'll summon lancers and bombards, which will be dealing with you throughout the fight. And he also has an ability called Disruptor Shock, which drains shields and also nullifies certain abilities. He also then has a health drain, should his health drop below a certain amount, and if you don't engage him, he will then wander over to a Grineer Soldier and start draining that Grineer Soldier's health. Although this is not very efficient, and chances are he's not going to do it, because if you're dealing damage to them, he just won't do it. Every now and then, Vehek's faceplates will be removed for him to taunt at you. At this point, he's vulnerable to damage so long as you shoot his face. Now, because he's such a sporadically little moving chicken thing, it's going to be very hard for you to hit this small target. So the recommendation is you want to try and hold him in place with something like a Rhino, or even a Slover if you have it, so that you can get as many shots off on the face as possible. You want to prioritize big chunky single shot damage on things like Vectis or Rubico, anything that can deal high amounts of damage in a very small condensed space of time, or very chunky single big shots. The high base damage weapons will be much more efficient in this situation. After losing 75% of his health, he goes into chicken mode. In chicken mode, otherwise known as phase 2, he loses all of his previous abilities and starts using a Heck Cannon, which deals a huge amount of blast damage in his cannon range. He then also has Heck Barrage, which is 4 to 5 missiles, much like the Jackal, which can be parried. And then he has a drone launch. These drones are very simple. They wander around, bubbling around, and they will just reduce your shields. You want to blast him as hard as possible at this point. Bearing in mind, corrosive damage is extremely useful, as he is also very weak in this mode to his face and his back. The drops for good old Vehek is Hydroid, as well as the components therein. He also drops he has a good percentage for Stretch, Cryo Rounds, and Molten Impact. Lech Kril spawns on War on Mars, and will only begin once the first person has gone onto his bridge on the final room. Initially, right off the bat, Lech Kril cannot take damage. You will need to take advantage of his cryostasis as well as his fire in order to deal damage to him. When a player goes into his melee range, he'll start using his hammer. When players are at range, he will use his Gorgon. He also has a multitude of fire abilities, such as Fire Wave, as well as a Fire Blast ability. However, you will rarely see these, as his attack animations will cause him to focus on his melee attacks rather than dealing damage to using any of these abilities. Now, the way you deal damage to him is you want to try and make him swing his hammer over his head to land down in front of him. This will cause his back to become vulnerable, at which point you can then deal damage to the tubes on his back. Every time you do this, when he becomes encased in ice, a tube will disconnect. Once all the tubes have disconnected, he will then engage Meltdown mode and enter Phase 2. Once the Meltdown has ended, and Phase 2 has begun, he discards his melee weapon, he discards his ranged weapons in fact, and will start dealing nothing but melee damage. He gains a couple of extra abilities in this phase as well. He will now be able to chuck his hammer at enemies at a medium range, dealing a large amount of impact damage. And at this point, all of his abilities are then fire-based. The previous abilities as well will also become empowered, dealing even more damage than they did before. The best advice that can be given for good old Lech Kril is to run in and out of his melee range. The AI of Lech Kril is not very smart. If you go into his melee range, he'll do a single overhead smash or a side swipe, and then if you move back out, he'll swap back to his Gorgon. Moving directly back into his melee range will confuse him so much to the point where he then picks his melee weapon back up and does the exact same thing, basically rendering most of his damage completely inoperable. Using a Slover or a Frost or anything that can slow down Lech Kril will expose him for slightly longer, allowing you to take more advantage of the exposed elements. Play it slow and safe. This is probably one of the first encounters you'll go into that might end up killing you. The drops for this encounter are Excalibur, and with a high chance of Stretch, Killing Blow, Energy Channel, as well as Molten Impact and Orokin Cells. The Sergeant is on Phobos, Iliad, and the strategy for this guy is he flashbangs and runs and then dies. Quite seriously, this is probably the most anticlimactic fight on the planet. He does nothing. I'm not even joking, he does nothing. He just dies. He drops Mag, good chance of Thief's Whip, Reflex Call, Shocking Touch, and higher Morphic chances as well.
Lech Kril and Captain Vor make a return on Ceres on Exeter. You're going to be fighting these two at the exact same time now, and they are going to be exactly the same as they were beforehand. But now you're going to have the combination of abilities overlapping with each other. So you'll be having the fire and the ice from Kril, and you'll be having all of the melee attacks and ranged attacks from Vor. You will also be dealing with a multitude of small adds, but essentially you will want to handle this as you handled them individually, just with a very keen eye being trained on when they're going to be close to each other, so their abilities don't overlap too heavily. The drops from this are Frost, as well as Mitre, as well as also Twin Gremlins. So this is a very good way to farm certain new weapons, as well as also getting a bunch of Orokin cells, as each one can drop one.
Alad V, or Salad V as he's otherwise known, spawns on Jupiter on Themisto. You'll be fighting Alad V and Zanuka at the same time in this situation. Alad V will be passive and attempt to flee, letting Zanuka do most of the work, although Alad does have abilities to watch out for. Alad V will put down a shield like Volt to try and block attacks. He also has a Flame Pulse, which is a large fire attack knocking enemies away. He has a Blinding Beam, which blinds enemy enemies if they're too close. So as you can tell, he's a bit of a pussy. Zanuka has lots of speed and mobility. He has a Missile Strike, much like Jackals, which you can parry, which fires several missiles which you'll need to either deflect or avoid. He has a Frost Bomb, which is a grey orb that fires out, and if you are within its range, you will take cold damage and be slowed. He has a Dispel Bomb, which will dispel any abilities such as Iron Skin on a Rhino, or any buff therein. All throughout the fight, there will be constant adds spawning, either mowers from the floor below, or troopers coming in from the door where you entered. The general strategy for this encounter is you want to focus on Alad V. Zanuka is extremely powerful and has stupidly strong shields initially for early game players, so the advice is to focus on Alad V. Once Alad V's shields are removed, Zanuka's shields will also be disabled, and if Alad V dies, Zanuka will then run over to Alad V to try and revive him. So the idea is you take down Alad V's shields initially, then you focus Zanuka until Zanuka dies, and then you focus Alad V. The general advice for this encounter: high fire rate weapons with magnetic damage for Zanuka is incredibly advised, or radiation and slash damage to take advantage of Alad V. A little tidbit: Fatal Teleport on Ash, if you have it available, will one-shot Zanuka. Other such execution-style attacks also have a higher rate of damage versus Zanuka as well, so take advantage of slows as well as execution-style mechanics. Alad V drops Valkyr, as well as a high chance of Intensify, Neural Sensors, and Orokin Cells, so this is a very good avenue for you to farm Neural Sensors in the early game. The Raptors spawn on Europa in the mission of Nama, a set of 3 heavily armoured Ospreys. One will spawn at a time, and to fight these you need to interact with the environment that they have come from. The idea here is every time you kill one of the Ospreys, they will drop a power cell. This needs to be picked up and dropped into the silo, or any silo that is in the room. After 10 seconds of being dropped, the power cell will explode, even if the player has picked it up from that point. So the bomb needs to be dumped into one of the silos to destroy the silo, and after all 3 silos have been destroyed, the mission ends. If you do not kill the silo, then the Osprey that you are fighting at the time will respawn. There are also constant adds spawning throughout this entire encounter, and each Osprey has a slightly different mechanic that you'll need to pay attention to. The Raptor NS has an explosive mortar which fires big beams which will leave a blue ring on the floor, then deal a mass amount of damage 1.5 seconds later. The Raptor MT summons constant theym drones which will fire little lasers and can have up to 5 up at any given time. The Raptor RV fires a Kamehameha type beam, dealing huge amounts of damage, and will then split into multiple beams out from that initial beam as well. The best advice: make sure to bring corrosive protection or corrosive attacks if you can to lower the armor, because they have a huge amount of armor, especially for the earlier game of Warframe. Take advantage of radiation damage as well, as that will also benefit the damage you deal. And utilize line of sight. A lot of the abilities these guys have are going to be based on whether they can see you or not. Bringing them closer to the ground to get better shots off them will also help. Keep an eye on where the power core lands, because you literally only have 10 seconds from when that thing appears to actually dump it into one of the silos. The drops from the Raptors are Nova, as well as a good chance of Reach, Split Chamber, Neural Sensors, and Organ Chatter. Sargus Rook is the Saturn boss and spawns on Tethys. This is a phased fight, much like Lech Kril. So Sargus Rook will be wandering slowly around using a variety of weapons. Initially, you have to wait for these abilities and these weapons to be used in order to deal damage to him, as he's invulnerable until he does. Using his abilities will generate heat into his body. After a small amount of time, after so many abilities have been used, he will expose a generator on one part of his armor, which will be shown via a very bright white light. You want to focus these as much as possible whilst they're exposed until they become invulnerable again. Throughout the entire fight, you will be dealing with a constant variety of lancers and bombards, as well as other Grineer enemy types. Every time a generator is destroyed on him, he will change up slightly into a different phase. Once the first body part has been destroyed, he will initially use his Ignis as a Ignis wood, and once the second part of his body has been destroyed, he will start using a Fire Blast, which is a huge ring of fire generating outwards from him, which will knock back as well as dealing a large amount of fire damage. After a third item on him has been destroyed, he will start using Inferno, which will summon huge pillars of fire that will spawn around the room. If done in the right manner, the final generator will be on his back, and once that is destroyed, he dies. However, there is a few things you want to pay attention to. If your damage is high enough, you can potentially skip limbs, meaning you can phase him multiple times in a single sitting. If you use high base damage weapons, for example Euphona, Lex, or any sniper rifle, it is very likely, especially with the right modding, you could potentially kill 2 limbs at a given time, which will mean you have multiple abilities to then deal with. Sargus Rook is the drop for Ember, as well as Orokin Cells and a bunch of other mods that we've already mentioned. Tyl Regor is the boss of Uranus. This is on the mission Titania. To actually start this fight, you will need everyone in the room, otherwise the engagement will not start. This is initially a very simple fight, however, with all the things going on, it may seem a bit more complicated than it actually is. Tyl Regor himself will utilize one of 2 abilities. He will either use a charge slash attack with his Aken Brunt. He will also use invisibility to subvert and get around and do all sorts of things. This is a multi-phase fight that as you deal damage to them, he will change the environment as well as summoning loads of little adds around the room. The main adds he will summon are Manics as well as Bombards and Xmas later in the fight. After enough damage is taken, Tyl Regor will then shoot his fists into the ceiling, sending water cascading down, cutting off part of the arena. At this point, he will become completely invisible and unattackable and summon a bunch of Manics and Xmas. You'll need to deal with these adds to begin the fight again. Once enough damage is dealt again, he will then leave once more and enter Phase 2. During the start of Phase 2, he will shoot his fists into the sky once more and completely submerge the lower portion in water. At this point, you will need to fight on the upper balcony, so to say, dealing with all the Manics and Xmas that he summoned, and then he will appear once more, allowing you to finish him off. This is not a very complicated fight, but can be very hectic with all the adds and water flooding all around, as well as all the pipes that can shoot you all over the place. The best advice for this fight is to bring high base damage weapons, things like snipers, shotguns, and anything therein, to make the quickest use of the Manics, as well as the Xmas. Corrosive and viral are going to be very useful here, and you want to try and be on the move so you don't get jumped on by the Manics. Having slows and stuns is also a very good idea to keep the Manics in check, as well as then dealing with the Xmas with their bombards as well. The drops for Tyl Regor is Equinox, as well as a high chance of Steel Fiber, True Steel, Gallium, and Orokin Cells. The Hyena pack is the boss of Neptune from the mission Samoth. This is a multi-encounter fight that will feel more like you're fighting a bunch of smaller dudes as opposed to a boss. You're essentially going to be fighting 4 weaker versions of Zanuka, and each of their attacks are based on elements. Hyena LN2 is based on ice and will use an ice wave, dealing a small amount of cold damage if you're hit, as well as slowing you. The Hyena NG uses a blast grenade, which deals a large amount of damage if you're hit, as well as in a small area, and also uses a fire wave, which will knock back and deal a ticking amount of fire damage. The Hyena PB uses an ability called Lead Storm, where it'll leap into the air and rain down projectiles of high damage. The Hyena TH uses a charge to knock down, as well as an electrical surge, as well as a radial wave of electricity, which will deal a magnetic and electrical damage, which will then cause you to lose shields, as well as energy. The best advice for the Hyena pack is to take them on one at a time. You have 4 people, focus on one, deal with them as you can. Slows and stuns are extremely useful, as they will be able to hold them in place, allowing you to deal more damage. Valkyr's Hysteria can nullify a lot of these effects, allowing her to freely DPS one of them down. Ash's Fatal Teleport, much like Zanuka, will also be able to one-shot these if they're used with covert lethality. And they are all weak to radiation, so building radiation with high base damage weapons will work extremely well. The Hyena pack drop Loki, as well as Orokin Cells, Trick Mag, True Steel, and North Wind. The Ambulas are the boss of Pluto on the mission Hades. To start this fight, you will need 20 Animo nav beacons, and each of you will need them in order to get in. You can farm these by fighting Ambulases from any open corpus map on Pluto. The encounter itself is a multi-ad encounter where you'll be fighting separate Ambulases. On the first wave, you'll deal with 1, and every wave thereafter, you'll deal with 2. You'll need to disable them by dealing enough damage to take out all their health. They'll then become disabled, allowing you to hack them. Hacking them will then turn them into a corrupted Ambulus, quote unquote. And when the dropship comes in, which will be done every minute or two, you will then pick up these hacked Ambuluses and take them to the big ship that is lying in the background. You will need to meet the criteria of enough hacked Ambuluses to complete the mission. Any Ambulus that has not been hacked will then add to a failure tally. 3 failures will negate to a failed mission. Throughout the encounter, you'll be dealing with a mixture of riflemen and technicians and skater boys that will be tuning in. The skaters have nullification abilities, which will cause you to lose all your shields and energy. You will also have to deal with Ospreys. When the first Ambulus gets disabled, and any Ambulus disabled thereafter, Ospreys will be summoned that will try to revitalize them. These must be focused in order to make sure they do not get reactivated and then add to the fail tally. The Ambuluses themselves are slightly different to regular Ambuluses, but they still follow much of the same mechanics. They have 3 main abilities, which is artillery fire, where they'll hunker down in their location and fire mortar fire, which will go up into the air and then land, dealing a ring of damage within a 1.5 meter radius of where it hits. They have a triple shockwave, where they deal 3 initial shock blasts, which will knock people back, as well as dealing a small amount of damage, as well as a laser slice ability. Words are hard. Laser slice will cause the Ambulus to bunker down in its location and then spin its upper turret around in a circle. Anyone hit will take a large amount of damage and be staggered.
One other thing to look out for as well is Fraud Beck's ship in the background. This will fire one of 2 types of missiles at your team, one of which is a projectile-based mortar, which will deal explosive damage in a small radius whenever they hit a location, and the other one is a Kamehameha-styled massive beam that will be targeted to one specific player, and will follow that player as they move. So that player needs to avoid other players and presumably hide behind any object they can to try and take this away from the team.
The best advice for this is to bring high amounts of radiation and puncture damage, as well as bringing frames that can slow and keep the ads in control as well. There are a couple of frames that are very useful here as well. Valkyr can remain immune to damage whilst dealing a huge amount of damage using her Hysteria. Volt's shield can block most of the attacks from the ship as well as any of the other enemies, and also make sure that no enemies reach the Ambulus to repair them. Nyx's mind control can also take control of the Ambuluses as well, giving you free reign to attack them. The drops from the Ambulus is Trinity, the healer. Enemies in this mission also have a heightened rate of dropping Morphics, as well as getting pressure point and heat mods. Any of the heat mods for weapons as well as melee. Killer the Theym is the boss of Sedna and the mission of Mero. This is an interesting one to get into because you'll need judgment points to get in. The arenas that you would have done beforehand will give you the arena points to get in. You will need 25 to actually start the mission, and each person in your team will need these, otherwise they will not be able to enter. The encounter itself will start you in a small room with 4 nodes on a platform. Each person in your team will need to stand on one of these nodes and then shoot the highlighted rings that are around the outside edge. Throughout the entirety of the encounter, you'll be dealing with rollers, which are very likely to knock you off the rings, making it very hard for you to channel this, because each of these rings need to be shot at the exact same time in order to progress to the next part of the fight. Ignis can be used to cheese this completely, as it will shoot through the rotating panel that covers them up, allowing you to shoot them regardless. After all the buttons have been shot at the same time, you will ascend into the upper arena to fight Kela herself. Once engaged, she will jump down into the middle of the arena and start fighting you. Again, you'll be dealing with rollers during this phase. Having crowd control for these is very, very useful. She is rather large. She has a huge health pool as well as a large amount of armor, which is also one of her downsides. After being dealt enough damage, she will disappear into the confines of a safe room and will leave you in the arena to fend for yourself. During this phase, she'll begin a bombardment where rings will appear on the ground, and after 1.5 seconds, they will be hit with a very, very, very powerful bombardment of missiles. These will pretty much one-shot you should you stand in them. During this phase, you will then need to repeat the challenge that you did initially before you ascended into the upper arena. However, this time, you will need to shoot all of the buttons rather than just one at a time. Once each ring has had their buttons shot, Kela will jump back down and re-engage. Now, when she jumps back down, she will gain a ripline ability which will allow her to tug herself around much more quickly, and will also use it on you as well to knock you down. The actual fight for this is not difficult. This is just a case of rinse and repeat until she's dead. Once she loses another 33% of her health, she will then disappear again and repeat the same challenge as before. Once she then jumps back down again, she'll be moving at the rate of a bullet, and you'll just need to knock her down until she dies. The best advice for this is to bring a Trinity or an Oberon. Because Kela has such a large health pool, Trinity can use her Energy Vampire to exploit this. Because Energy Vampire is based on a percentage of her health, you will deal a huge chunk of damage using your Energy Leech. Oberon will take advantage of the armor. Oberon's Smite ability will deal a gigantic amount of damage because of the pure radiation damage it deals. This will quite literally one-shot her or two-shot her in most situations. Valkyr can also be used as well as Mesa for good DPS and survivability, or if you're looking to play a bit slower, Limbo's Cataclysm and Rift abilities will keep you alive whilst being able to revive teammates who may be down from the bombs or the rollers. The drops for Killer the Theym is Sarin, as well as Arcan Cells, and a bunch of very useful unique mods that are only obtained from this fight. Acidic Shell for Sobek, Mediray, Nightwatch Napalm, Rift Strike, Vulcan Blitz, and the blueprint for Twin Comac as well. The Jordas Golem is a boss on Eris with its own unique mission. This is also part of a quest line that you'll need to do to initially get access to this quest, however you can taxi along with other people to get into this as well. One player will need to get to the final room, as well as the other players to start the encounter. You'll initially fight a Juggernaut-style beast that uses similar abilities, but just with much more health and slightly higher damage. The weak spot on this would be its belly, as well as using any attacks that can then seep through the outer layer of the Juggernaut. Once the Juggernaut is dead, you will then get sucked out into space to begin an Arcwing-style encounter where you fight the Jordas Golem itself. The Jordas Golem is pretty straightforward. The main focus is to shoot its butt where the exhaust vents are. The Jordas Golem will be dipping, ducking, dodging, diving around the entire arena while summoning a bunch of Mutalist Ospreys that will fire high projectile damage to anyone they come within the range of. The abilities of the Jordas Golem initially are a Fire Wave, which will knock anyone back and stun them, a Maggot Missile, much like a Jackal Missile, just Mutalist based, a Ball Lightning that will fire from its tendrils, that you really want to try to avoid, as these can deal a huge amount of damage. The best advice here is to bring either an Odonata for the huge damage buff you gain from your 1, and Amisha to slow down. Amisha also has the unnatural talent of confusing the AI of the Jordas Golem as well, causing him to sporadically just spin in place, do nothing, or get completely confused and forget he's even a boss. You want to bring Corrosive Projection. Jordas Golem has an absurd amount of armor, and even one Corrosive Projection can shorten the fight by up to 5 minutes. This is an encounter that requires you to have pretty decently modded Arcwings as well as weapons. Seeing as this will be the first time you encounter an Arcwing fight that is difficult, you might find this very difficult on your first attempt. However, bringing Grattler, Fluctus, Velocitus, or Imperative Vandal are very good choices of weapons, but all weapons will be good with decent modding. The drops from the Jordas Golem are Atlas, as well as a high amount of Neurodes. Mutalist Alad V is another boss on Eris with its own unique mission. Mutalist Alad V will require one person in your team to have a key. The Mutalist Alad V key requires a blueprint, which is gained from a questline, as well as then needing Mutalist Alad V nav coordinates, which are dropped from the Arcan Derelict or other missions and invasions. The fight itself is pretty straightforward. Alad V will wander around aimlessly with a infested weapon which will deal small amounts of damage to anyone he hits with it. However, he does have a couple of abilities you want to pay attention to. The main ability he has is Infested Barrier. You cannot deal damage to him whilst his collar is on, which generates this buff. He will occasionally use a Flare Burst, which is a big knockback, which will push anyone away. He will occasionally take off his collar, leaving himself vulnerable, and use a Collar Beam ability, so to say. This beam deals a pretty high substantial amount of damage to anyone who's in front of him whilst he uses it, but can very easily be avoided, especially if there are slows in play. And the most annoying ability is the Collar Throw. Any Tenno that this lands on will then become mind-controlled and start fighting their own team. This can either be focused on with crowd control to crowd control the person who gets mind controlled, or in most cases this will just wear off instantly because of the amount of damage you're dealing to Alad V whilst he's in this mode, as when he becomes immune again, the mind control wears off instantly. The focus here is to wait for the collar to come off and for him to use his abilities for this to happen. High base damage weapons to take advantage of the vulnerable phases is advisable, as well as taking advantage of corrosive, viral, and slash damage for the time that he is vulnerable. Slows and slow stuns, such as Rhino Stomp, are also very advised here, as they can be very useful for keeping him in place. Mutalist Alad V drops Mesa, as well as Arcan Cells and Neurodes. Lephantis is a unique boss found on the Arcan Derelict, which will require you to use a key in order to get into, although only one person will need that key. This will start when all players have entered the final room, and initially you're going to be fighting 3 separate heads. The infested corpus head is a square-faced thing which will have multiple tendrils on its face. This will fire toxin grenades, which are projectile-based and deal large amounts of damage to anyone hit by them, as well as a small amount of AoE damage. He will also use infested pods, which will fire off and summon small amounts of adds from the pods. You can destroy the pods to stop these adds from spawning. The infested Grenier head, it uses a big scythe, which causes a knockdown should you be hit. Nothing too hard to deal with, but the exposed face is on the chest, as well as the open mouth should he use a frontal attack. The Ancient Infested is the one with the very long trunk, which will open up his chest when he decides to shoot things. He also uses sticky bombs, as well as explosive bombs. After all the heads have been defeated on the upper floor, Lephantis will then crack the floor open and send your entire team plummeting down to the floor below. At this point, you will have to fight all 3 heads at the exact same time, whilst Lephantis now has a body. The fight is exactly the same as it would be normally. Instead, now you also have the added ability of a body slam, where if you go too close to Lephantis, he will slam his body down, dealing a large amount of impact damage and knocking you away. The drops for Lephantis is Necros, as well as a Neurode, and some very peculiar bronze mods, which have no particular use, however they're quite nice to complete your mod set with. And the final assassination you will have to deal with is a bit more of a unique one, in the way that it spawns, as it will spawn as an invasion when the invasion takes the place of an assassination mission. So this can spawn at any given time that an invasion spawns on an assassination mission within the star chart. The fight itself is incredibly straightforward. He is an oversized, infested grunt runner thing. He's going to charge around the arena, dealing knockback damage as well as a large amount of damage to anyone he melees. There aren't many mechanics here other than the fact he has a huge amount of a health pool as well as a lot of armor, so will take a lot of damage to take down. He will also be constantly summoning infested minions to his side. He'll just need to deal with these as they spawn. The base advice here is to bring slows, stuns, and anything to keep the enemy in place, as the boss itself does not really suffer from any major abilities that will deal damage to you. Phorid drops Nyx, as well as any item that would be relevant to that planet. Hopefully you found this video interesting and informative. If you have, do leave a like, share it to your friends, tell your friends and family about it, and hopefully I will see all you top hunters in the next video. Also, if you do have suggestions for future videos as well, please leave a comment in the comment section below and we'll happily take a look at what you suggest.